So first, thank you, Admiral, for those remarks. It's great being on a panel with you. We met about 5 years ago or so when I was in Norfolk at the part of the pilot project. And it's great to be back here at Wharton, where I received my degree some 20 years ago. So thanks for inviting me, Professor White and Professor Orts. I promise to do you proud. Some of my critical thinking skills and some of what I learned at Wharton actually did serve me quite well in the Navy throughout my 20 years in the Navy. Although I always found myself as like the treasurer or some kind of collateral duty as a finance major. So you can fly planes and you can be a lawyer, but we also want you to handle the money as well. So they came in good hands. I'm just going to briefly sort of walk around the globe. And Admiral Phillips talked a little bit about the different challenges the military is working through. And I'm going to talk about the legal and geopolitical pieces that I see both as an academic now at Penn Law School, but also my experience as a practitioner, as an attorney, kind of in the nitty-gritty, seeing it being implemented. And I would say that the climate change, national security piece, or just climate change in general, the issues are real, they're ripe, they're unresolved. And there really is a place for academics. There really is a place for people like myself in the pilot project who are on the ground working these issues. And it's a really sort of all hands on deck evolution, to borrow a term from the Navy, in terms of who's going to solve this problem. But how do you bound this idea of climate change as a national security threat? It can be a little bit overwhelming, and I like to think of it as sort of three different ways. The first one is, of course, climate adaptation. We talked about planning for or investing in climate-resilient infrastructure at military installations. That sort of makes intuitive sense. The trick with that, of course, is from a legal standpoint, Congress has the appropriations power. So if you want to raise a carrier pier, if you want to raise the infrastructure, if you want to invest in that climate-resilient infrastructure, Congress has to play a role. I was encouraged, based upon the NDAA, that Congress is going to study it. But ultimately, the fiscal authorities have to flow via Congress. But the second piece of the climate adaptation at a military installation is sort of planning. And then Congress doesn't have as much necessarily authorities there. The executive can put out floodplains management, can put out just general guidance and zoning. We have what's called the Unified Facilities Criteria in the Department of Defense, which requires in some capacity to plan for a climatic adaptation within the military. There's also DoD directives, which were passed during the Obama administration, but they're still in the books. And we were talking about this at dinner last night. So much gets lost in all this, but the ball was moved significantly forward, I think, in the climate change federal national security space during the Obama years. But most of those core documents are still there. They're just not being talked about as publicly as maybe some might wish, and the ball maybe not be advancing as much as people desire, but they're still there, and the military is still required to plan for climate change's impacts. The second piece is climate mitigation, right? And there's really kind of two threads to this. Greenhouse gas emissions. When the Paris Treaty came out, it was signed. I was one of the people that just ran through that document, just seeing if Paris was going to address military as having some sort of opt-out provision. It didn't, actually. The military was part of the Paris Framework Agreement, and seeing where that goes forward, the other militaries of the world will have to reconcile with this. Obviously, the United States, our position is a little more complicated with Paris, but I do think you have to recognize the enormous amount of greenhouse gas emissions that the military is responsible for. By institution, the U.S. military, I believe, is the largest greenhouse gas emitter by institution in the world. Roughly, the country of Sweden is essentially the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions that the United States military does. The second piece of climate mitigation, it's a loose part of it is sort of this notion of operational military, or operational energy. That's a notion that being too reliant on fossil fuels actually harms the warfighter. It actually undermines his or her ability to respond in a tactical environment and could indeed cost that person's life. Just think of a fossil fuel convoy line in Afghanistan that's exposed to the enemy. General Mattis famously said when he was central commander or commander in Afghanistan, to unleash us from the tether of fuel. This isn't looking at reducing fossil fuel emissions based upon some notion of green energy or being an environmental steward. It's a bottoms-up solution addressing a practical problem that's looking at saving lives. And the third piece, I think, is the most fascinating piece from just a legal standpoint, is the military response. How do we respond to what I call climate-induced disasters? People have said, the Center for Naval Analysis has called climate change a threat multiplier, a catalyst for conflict. And I subscribe to that. I think that those studies have a sound basis in intelligence and science. In military response, whether it be the Syria or the Arctic, the legal authorities and legal responsibilities are actually somewhat different depending on who you are. In Puerto Rico this morning, that is a different military response equation than a humanitarian assistance in Haiti or another foreign nation. The legal authorities flow from there. This is significant, I think, because there's a lot of discussion about science, and sort of science is sort of we need to get good science, and as some of the earlier panels a little bit, depressing, and sort of like how the American public is not exactly viewing science the way maybe people in this room view the climate change science as caused by human behavior. But the second leg of that, I think, which is often not discussed, is intelligence. Because in the military, intelligence drives resources, intelligence drives operations, and the 2016 National Intelligence Council, again, a nonpartisan, serious members of the intelligence community, essentially adopted in full stead the IPCC's view on future extreme weather events. It's in the report, it's open source, you can download it today. And so intelligence is part of that key equation that often gets lost in the mix because intelligence has to drive operations. The military has a unique culture. It's deep-seated for 200 plus years of planning for the unknown, right? And climate change, I would submit, is the ultimate unknown. In Norfolk, Virginia, I'll start here my quick trip around the world before I hand it over to my next speaker. But Norfolk Naval Station, this is a snapshot photo of 5 aircraft carriers in Norfolk. The sea is rising and the soil is sinking in Norfolk, Virginia. And what happens in Norfolk, Virginia is critically important for just military operations around the world. We think of the Syria airstrikes, and people can argue and disagree about the political, legal, should we have done it, should we have not done it. 3 of the warships from the Syria airstrike just last week were actually based in Norfolk, Virginia. When you think of climate change, and you think of infrastructure at military bases, the training, the readiness, the preparation, everything associated with having the military be ready to fight has to occur at the home. If an extreme weather event, if the aircraft carrier piers are not adequately resilient, then that's just simply not going to happen. So it really is a true global problem. Climate mitigation, of course, is greenhouse gas emissions, and General Mattis's quote about unleashing us from the tether of fuel. It's interesting, in Afghanistan, towards the latter part of the conflict, you had Marines using solar blankets and using sort of innovative energy solutions, alternative energy solutions at the forward operating bases, because they didn't want to be reliant upon those fossil fuels. Syria, I promised, people have talked about Syria before, and I promised I didn't share my slides with them ahead of time, but there's a common thread of climate change as being sort of setting the stage for conflict. In 2006 to 2009, actually began in 2005, Syria suffered its worst drought in modern history that most scientists, the National Academy of Scientists, believe it was exacerbated severely by climate change. And the legal part of it is how are we going to wrestle with this idea of climate refugees? They have no political special status, like political asylum seekers. But if the government has not provided the ability to keep them safe, or climate change has exacerbated their security situation, how are we going to wrestle with this idea as lawyers? The next piece is the Arctic, and I'll sort of wrap up here before I turn it over to my speaker. What's happening in the Arctic, and I know I'm kind of going around the world from Norfolk to Afghanistan to Syria and the Arctic, but it just kind of shows the impact of climate change. It's affecting the operational environment. that the Navy and the world is seeking. When you think of the Arctic, it's a fascinating situation. We don't often look at the Arctic because it's North Pole, Santa Claus lives there, it's not part of the the globe, but it's like an orange stem, the stems of an orange. It's the only place in the world where 5 nations are all converging at one point. And the critical piece of this are the 5 nations of Denmark, Norway, United States, Canada, and Russia, because they all have continental shelves in the Arctic. 4 of those 5 nations are signatories of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The United States is not a party to that convention, so we're somewhat limited in terms of our continental shelf claims. The so what on that is about where anywhere from 20 to 30% of the unexplored oil and gas resources reside in the world. So the other piece of the Arctic, which is fascinating from a geopolitical perspective, is that Russia is about half of the Arctic region, but the other 4 nations are NATO members. There's also 4 million people that live in the Arctic region. So how we reconcile and deal with that should be fascinating. I just put down here Greenland's future, and I'm about out of time. Greenland is a fascinating case. I just submit it just to look into it. There's about 50,000 people that live in Greenland to this day. Greenland is melting as we speak. It is opening natural resources. It is opening minerals. Greenland is technically a region, autonomous region of Denmark, but there is a tension emerging between the Greenlanders who are seeking independence and seeking mineral extraction for economic reasons, and Denmark, which is trying to somewhat restrict that. There's some speculation that indeed Greenland could be the first nation born from climate change. Look at Greenland. And there's obviously new trade routes which are shortcutting the distance between Asia and the United States. I'll stop there on this and just highlight 2 things before I turn it over. We have a National Guards member and a Coast Guard member. When we think of domestic response, responding to a natural disaster, we're going to see an increased role for the Coast Guard, which has broad authorities, an increased role for National Guardsmen and National Guardswomen who have special legal authorities to respond to natural disasters. So with that, I think I'm somewhat out on time, so I'll turn over to the next panelist.